Hi, everybody. I just finished New Explorations in the Lost World of Genesis by John Walton. This is published by IVP Academic. Thank you to IVP for sending me this copy for review. This is my honest reaction to the book, my honest take on the book. I'll step you through my typical format in these reviews. I'll cover the main idea of this book, the research behind it, the readability of its style, and then I'll give some of my reaction at the end, just some of my general thoughts. But this book is in the Lost World series of books by John Walton, a couple of which are co-authored, but they're primarily written by him. I've read the entire series so far. I really have liked these books to varying degrees. I like some of them more than others, but in general, I've liked the books. I've liked the approach. I really, really like the desire to ground the Genesis texts in particular in the ancient Near East setting and the kind of comparative study that he does with other similar stories from other cultures around that time. He really leverages as much up-to-date findings in archaeological findings and textual discoveries and stuff. Like he really is trying to ground what Genesis is doing and what the authorial intention of Genesis was in comparison to the setting and the time and place that it was written in. I really, really like all of that. I've really appreciated that kind of posture in the whole series. So that's why I was really intrigued by this one. This is very much in the series, but it's also a very different kind of book than the rest of the books in the series. So I was just really intrigued by what he's doing here. So let me just summarize the main idea then. Essentially what Walton is doing in this book is he is kind of recapitulating some of the major theses of not the whole series. He doesn't really talk about the flood or the Torah or the Israelite conquest in this book. This book is mostly revisiting the core ideas in his books, The Lost World of Genesis 1 and The Lost World of Adam and Eve. In particular, those are the two main ones he's revisiting. But he takes some of the core arguments of those books and he summarizes them here and then is trying to incorporate new advances in the field and place those against the ideas or the theses or arguments he's advanced in those prior publications, comparing them to feedback or new advances, and then revisiting some of the ideas and asking, do these need to be nuanced or made more precise or even changed? And so he goes through, I'm not giving any specific examples yet. I'll give more examples in my reaction at the end, but a couple of things that he does is he takes his idea of Eden as a temple, for example, and then he compares that to more recent study, since he argued for that in the Lost World Genesis 1, and then he asks the question, do I still or should I still advance the idea that Eden is a temple space? Or Adam and Eve as priestly figures? Is this a good way to continue to think about Adam and Eve, given the new studies that have been done or reactions to my studies that have been published since I wrote them? That's what this book is about, and he steps through different ideas in that vein. Here's the idea. Here's some new studies that have come out or new advances in archaeological findings, for example. And then here are some questions that people have asked me. There's literally, each chapter has a frequently asked questions section about that idea. Here's 5 to 15 questions that come up. Here's how I respond to each of them, and here's maybe how my ideas have shifted or changed. That's what this book is about. It's very interesting. It doesn't quite fit stylistically into what all the rest of the books in the series are. And there's also not one overarching idea. It's more of like a scattershot of lots of different, revisiting lots of different ideas that were put forth in those earlier books in the series. So that's what New Explorations in the Lost World Genesis is. It's revisiting lots of different disparate ideas. So there isn't one kind of super clear thread, other than the thread being, do any of these ideas need to be revisited given light of new explorations, new studies, new advances in the field of archaeology in particular. So that leads me into the research. The research is interesting. The research here is, I would say, primarily archaeological findings or new discoveries around text and language. He does incorporate some academic publications that have come out in the intervening years since he wrote those early books in the Lost World series, and he does bring those in to kind of push back on some of the findings or some of the things that he advanced or proposed. But it's not, he doesn't really converse a lot with theology or theologians. He mostly converses on the historical, cultural background, archaeological findings, and a little bit of linguistic, ancient languages kind of side of things. That's mostly where he parks in terms of interacting with feedback or pushbacks or whatever. It's not a lot of argument about the theology as opposed to the history in the background, which won't be a surprise to you if you've read a lot of the Lost World books. But he is mostly. I don't keep up with like journal publications. I just don't have time to keep up with, especially archaeology, and that's just outside of my day-to-day work as a pastor. And even though I do love reading, I can't keep up with the field enough to say, I can't identify chapter and verse and name of, he should have brought in this research or he should have brought in this area of research. That's just beyond my ability to kind of keep track of the advances in the field, all told. But I feel like he did a good job at bringing in people who even maybe disagreed with him or pushed back on some of his ideas. I'll say more about that in the reaction. So anyways, yeah, that's the research. A little bit on the research here, but there's kind of a lot. The book is all over the place in some ways, so there's a lot of different areas that he dips into. Now the readability of it this is a complicated one to identify for me. Stylistically, it's very similar to a lot of the Lost World books. I would actually put this on the easier end of the spectrum in terms of it's more like books like the Lost World of Genesis 1 in terms of readability. It's very easy to understand what he's talking about. It's not overly in the weeds, or it's not overly academic or dry, or even though he does get into linguistic stuff, it's not weighted down with too much ancient language work. So page for page, it's pretty readable, but the structure of the book works a little bit against its readability, in my opinion, and it's because of that scattershot approach. Each chapter is kind of its own idea. It includes a summary of his previously stated argument. It includes a summary of new advances in the field, and then it includes a bunch of frequently asked questions that move through lots of different kind of tangentially related topics to that main idea. And so that scattershot approach, I don't know, I had a little bit of a love-hate relationship with it. I like all the ground he covers, but I found it a little bit hard to like track threads, or you're just constantly kind of shifting from topic to topic to topic. And so I don't know, take that for what it's worth. It's not an unreadable book by any means. It's very understandable, but it's just structurally it's a little bit different. So yeah, those are my thoughts on the readability. I don't want to belabor that point. But let's get into my reaction. Here. What I want to do, in my reaction, I'm torn on this book. You can probably tell in the way I'm talking about it. But I want to say, in my reaction, I want to move through 3 parts here. I want to say things that I appreciated. I want to talk about some things that I wrestled with. And then I want to end on a note of appreciation. So those are kind of my three things I want to note here in my reaction. So first of all, I appreciate he gets into some granular stuff here in a way that I appreciated. So I'll give a couple more specific examples. There's a really interesting discussion here about whether Eden should be considered a temple or a sacred space. And he essentially, through his presentation of the summary of how he presented that argument before, that Eden is a temple space in the literature, he essentially has changed his mind on that, and he actually is arguing more that he thinks that Eden is presented as kind of a divine realm, and he actually is proposing this really provocative, interesting idea that Eden is actually a divine realm in which Adam and Eve as figures were taken out of the human realm and placed in it for a time. That's a really interesting idea, and I feel like this book has lots of really interesting, provocative kind of ideas in it. Another one is that he shifts his thinking. In the Lost World of Genesis 1, he talks a lot about function and how he believes Genesis 1 is a functional account of creation. And he really works in this book to say he essentially is moving away from that language and moving more towards the language of order, or order versus non-order or disorder. And he really tries to move the whole argument more towards the thematic coherence around order. That's also very interesting. There's also a very interesting discussion of the role the serpent plays and how to think about the serpent, and whether or not we should think about the serpent as being connected explicitly to a Satan figure or more of just a neutral chaos figure, which he argues is much more in line with other ancient accounts, like Babylonian accounts had these chaos figures, and that we shouldn't be so quick, to label it evil or Satan or a Satan figure. at least as Genesis itself is presenting it. That's very interesting and pretty provocative. And then one more example. In my opinion, probably one of the more provocative elements of this book in particular is his reconsideration of the fall as a biblical event. And he argues that he essentially is arguing that we should move away from this notion of Genesis 3 as a fall, as a decisive fall from a state of perfection or a state of bliss. And he actually sounds like he's moved more in that direction, as in away from thinking of Genesis 3 as a fall narrative. And he unpacks why he keeps moving in that direction in this book in some really, really interesting and provocative ways. And so that's my first note of appreciation of this book, is that it takes a lot of what is interesting and provocative about the Lost World series, and it just expands them, and it deepens them in certain chapters in certain ways. And I felt provoked in a good way. I felt provoked in a sort of a thoughtful way, and I was revisiting some of these ideas that I haven't thought about since I read those original Lost World books. And so I really, really appreciate that effort here. That's my first note of appreciation. Now, my note of the reason I'm so mixed on this book. I'm mixed on this book because that scattershot approach, I felt like, and even my use of the term provocative and provoked reaction, this book provokes a lot of reaction, but in my view, I don't think there's enough depth in any individual provocation. And I kept having this feeling of like, wow, it's really interesting to kind of stretch my thinking around the serpent as a chaos figure, or I'm really intrigued by this moving away from the fall, from kind of a strict rendering of Genesis 3 as a fall narrative. But I just felt like there wasn't enough depth in this particular book to really make a stronger case. It felt like it was a lot more of just proposing tantalizing ideas and proposing some good evidence for why, like, he's just not making this stuff up out of whole cloth, and it's grounded really well in ancient Near East studies. But gosh, I just didn't feel like there was enough there for any individual provocative idea to really go farther. And it ends up being a collection of a lot of, again, really interesting, really provocative, and thoughtful ideas and propositions and questions, but none of them really, really decisively land the plane, which left me feeling mixed. And that kind of goes back to the structure and the scattershot approach of the book. I wonder if I frequently felt like there were maybe too many pages devoted to like frequently asked questions in each chapter, and I wish maybe some of that space would have been carved up and given to a more of an in-depth study of kind of where he's landing on each particular topic. So that's where I'm a little mixed on this. But I do want to land this review by noting something I really appreciate overall, and I think this should not be understated. It's pretty remarkable for a scholar like him who's written a lot and published consistently, and is well-studied, to essentially put out a book like this that chronicles some of the ways he's changed his mind. I think that's a significant thing, and I really want to commend him for that, and commend IVP for kind of chasing this project down, because he lands the concluding chapter is essentially here are the handful of things that I actually think differently on now, and he actually leaves a little personal reflection on the importance of being willing to rethink your ideas, and that, the life of a scholar, the life of learning, is just that. It's a life of learning and changing and being willing to adjust prior conclusions if evidence or conviction leads you to that place. And I think he's modeling that in this book in a really, really interesting way that I think is very commendable and very mature, and I think is a good model for a lot of us who want to be learned and studied and nuanced and mature in the ways that we approach these questions. So I really do in an overarching way, I really appreciate that spirit and that modeling in this book, given even with some of my mixed reactions to it that I just chronicled a minute ago. And what I want to say, just to land this review totally now, is just by way of recommendation. I don't think this is a good book to start the Lost World series on. I would not recommend this as your entry point to the series. I do very much recommend the series. I especially recommend, The Lost World of Genesis 1, The Lost World of the Torah, I think are standout books. I think The Lost World of Scripture is an underappreciated title in the series. I think it's very good. The whole series is worth reading, but those are the ones I would start with in particular. And I think if you are a fan of the series and you are interested in some of those provocative, kind of tantalizing questions, and interested to see kind of where Walton is going as a scholar and where his studies have pushed him. I think this is a really great book, but it's just I just am not sure I'd recommend this just like with a blank recommendation just for anybody. I think it's very specifically tailored to people who are deeply into what he's doing in the series and would appreciate more nuancing and more stretching in some terminology arguments and more stretching in some theological kind of wrestling matches around some of the implications of his views. But it's a fairly specific audience, I think, that this book would be most beneficial for. So if that's you, then by all means read it and get it, but just kind of know what you're getting into. And especially if you are interested in debates around origins and Genesis and that literature, but you haven't read the Lost World books yet, I would say start with other books in the series. And then if they really intrigue you, then maybe dip into this one. So those are my thoughts on the really interesting kind of mixed reaction, but also just ultimately very interesting book from John Walton and IVP, New Explorations in the Lost World of Genesis. As always, thanks for taking a few minutes to watch.